How much does Azure cloud migration actually cost? A realistic breakdown. Welcome back. Today's topic is how much does Azure cloud migration actually cost? A realistic breakdown. We'll cover what you actually need to know about Azure cloud migration cost. Next up, now, what actually drives Azure cloud migration cost? The honest answer is that Azure cloud migration cost scales with three things: how much you have to move, how old and tangled your current environment is, and how much work needs to happen before the first server ever touches Azure. Teams that underestimate the third category are the ones that blow budgets. The number of workloads, servers, databases, and custom integrations in your current environment has the most direct impact on cost. A company running 20 virtual machines with standard web applications and a SQL Server backend can migrate much faster and more cheaply than one running 200 servers with custom middleware, legacy complex components, and point-to-point integrations between 6 different systems. Most Azure infrastructure assessment engagements start by cataloging everything in the current environment. Tools like Azure Migrate and Azure Site Recovery can automate much of this discovery, but the analysis, specifically the dependency mapping, migration wave sequencing, and identifying what needs re-architecting, requires experienced engineers to interpret the data. Now, the 5 phases of Azure migration and their costs. The 5 phases of Azure migration are: assess, plan, migrate, optimize, and govern. Each has a different cost profile, and skipping or underinvesting in the early phases reliably inflates costs in the later ones. An Azure infrastructure assessment typically runs $8,000 to $25,000 depending on environment complexity. This phase uses Azure Migrate to discover workloads, maps application dependencies, identifies compliance gaps, and produces a migration roadmap with recommended wave sequencing. Some teams try to skip this or run it informally. That's almost always a mistake. The dependency mapping alone prevents the most expensive kind of migration failure, taking a server offline mid-migration and discovering that 3 other applications relied on it. Let's talk about moving on to Azure cloud migration cost ranges by company size. These ranges are based on real engagements, not vendor-optimized estimates. DIY migrations can look cheaper in consulting fees but tend to accumulate technical debt and operational issues that cost more to fix later. A hybrid cloud Azure setup, where some workloads remain on-prem during a phased transition, generally adds 10 to 20% to these ranges for hybrid connectivity and management overhead during the transition period. Now, how Azure consulting services affect total cost. Working with Azure consulting services firms is not just a line item. It changes how much risk you carry through the migration and what state the environment is in when you're done. A Microsoft Azure consulting company that earns the designation does several things beyond moving servers. They should be mapping dependencies before migration, architecting the landing zone, running an Azure security assessment, validating each migration wave before moving to the next, and setting up monitoring and alerting so the team has full visibility after handoff. Q Services, as a Microsoft certified solutions partner specializing in Azure, includes an Azure security assessment as a standard part of every migration engagement. We've seen too many migrations where security was treated as an afterthought, and the client spent more fixing vulnerabilities post-migration than they spent on the migration itself. Now, moving on to how to migrate on-premise to Azure without overspending. Migrate on-premise to Azure engagements go over budget for predictable, avoidable reasons. The biggest one is underestimating the assessment and planning phases. The second is treating CI/CD pipeline work as a separate future project when it belongs inside the migration scope. Teams that invest in Azure DevOps consulting services during the migration, rather than treating it as a separate future project, typically see faster post-migration deployment velocity and fewer rollbacks. Building CI/CD pipelines as you migrate means each workload arrives in Azure with automated deployment from day one. Our Azure DevOps CI/CD pipelines guide covers the specifics of what those pipelines should include for common workload types. The cost for DevOps pipeline setup typically runs $1,500 to $5,000 per application depending on complexity, testing requirements, and whether you're implementing environment-specific deployment gates. Next up, let's talk about Azure cost optimization consulting, cutting spend post-migration. Most organizations land in Azure and then overspend for 6 to 12 months before anyone looks seriously at the bill. This is common, but it's avoidable with a structured post-migration optimization process. The lift-and-shift approach almost always produces over-provisioned VMs. The original on-prem servers were sized for peak load with headroom for growth. In Azure, you're paying for that unused capacity every day. Azure Cost Optimization Consulting focused on right-sizing typically identifies 20 to 40% waste within the first 90 days post-migration. For the specific tactics that actually move the needle, see our Azure Cost Optimization, 7 Proven Ways to Cut Spending post, which covers both the quick wins and the structural changes that compound over time. Now, what does an Azure Managed Services provider actually cost? Ongoing managed services are the part of total Azure cloud migration cost that surprises teams most, because it doesn't appear in the migration project quote. An Azure Managed Services provider typically charges on one of 3 models: per resource, percentage of Azure spend, or a flat monthly retainer. For mid-market companies spending $5,000 to $30,000 per month on Azure consumption, managed services typically add $2,000 to $8,000 per month. What drives that range is the scope of coverage, monitoring and alerting only, versus active management including patching, backup verification, incident response, and optimization reviews. Next up, is Azure cheaper than AWS for enterprise workloads? This question comes up in almost every enterprise evaluation, and the real answer depends heavily on your existing licensing position. Azure tends to win on total cost for Microsoft-heavy organizations, those running Windows Server, SQL Server, .NET applications, Active Directory, or Microsoft 365. The Azure hybrid benefit, combined with existing enterprise agreement pricing, can make Azure 30 to 50% cheaper than equivalent AWS infrastructure for these workloads. Gartner's cloud strategy research consistently shows that organizations migrating Microsoft workloads to Azure see better total cost of ownership than those moving the same workloads to AWS. Egress costs catch a lot of teams off guard. So does the cost of Azure Firewall at scale, which is priced per deployment hour plus per GB processed, not intuitive for teams used to on-prem firewall appliances. Licensing for third-party software running on Azure, such as antivirus tools, monitoring platforms, and backup solutions, often gets missed in migration budgeting entirely. Now, moving on to how Q Services approaches Azure cloud migration. Q Services is a Microsoft-certified solutions partner specializing in Azure, with 500-plus Azure and Microsoft platform projects completed since 2014 across healthcare, financial services, logistics, and SaaS. We run every migration through a structured process: assess, plan, migrate, optimize, and govern. The assessment phase is non-negotiable for us. We've inherited too many migrations from other firms where the assessment was skipped, and the client is still paying for those shortcuts 3 years later. Now, moving on to conclusion. Azure cloud migration cost ranges from $15,000 for a small business moving a handful of servers to $2 million or more for a large enterprise with complex regulatory requirements and hundreds of workloads. The number depends on your environment's complexity, the migration approach you choose, how seriously you invest in the assessment and landing zone phases, and what managed services coverage you need after go-live. The most expensive migrations we've seen weren't the largest. They were the ones where teams skipped the assessment, chose a low-bid Azure migration partner with thin Azure depth, or treated security and compliance as a post-migration cleanup task. Getting Azure consulting services from a qualified Microsoft Azure consulting company at the start of an engagement consistently costs less than fixing those problems in production. If you want a realistic estimate for your specific environment, reach out to Q Services for an initial conversation. We'll give you an honest assessment of what we see in environments like yours and what it will realistically take to get to Azure successfully.